Hello, welcome to the News Tech Makers, a podcast where we talk about at-scale application development, deployment, and management. Thanks for joining us today. This is Swapnil Bhartiya for the News Tech. Let's go and meet our next guest.
So we are here at the beautiful Sonoma to attend the Open Source Leadership Summit. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and what you're doing here?
So I'm on a mission to make it easy to reuse free, libre, and open source software.
And who are you?
So my name is Philippe Ombredan, and I have been contributing to several free and open source projects, originally a lot around Eclipse and Java. Been a committer to JBoss, Eclipse, and a few other projects, helped a bit on Mozilla in the past. Most lately, I'm focusing on tools, which are free and open source tools, to uncover the origin and license, and a few other interesting facts about free and open source software. It's like open source and open source.
Okay. And when you say you're on the mission, so who benefits from this mission?
Well, I think everyone benefits from this mission. The thing is that the way we build software today is mostly like Legos. So you take bricks, and you assemble something which makes sense for function, an application, a system of sorts. What free and open source software enables is having this huge reservoir of bricks that you can tap in and assemble. The more there is to it, the easier it is to consume and integrate better. And in some ways, the skills for the future is not so much coding. Well, we always need to build the bricks. You need to have bricks builders, but it's being able to assemble these bricks in something that makes sense. So knowing which bricks to pick, how to put them together, where to put a bit of super glue so the things stick together nicely. And I don't know why, I just like that. I like a lot of the community aspect, and I enjoy contributing and building communities, and very wide ranging. For instance, I contribute modestly some C code in S-Trace, which is a system called Tracer for a fairly low level. I help on the kernel side, mostly on the licensing of the kernel, and you can see my names in commits and reviews and sign-offs at times. I mostly dabble in Python, but I've been doing Java also, so a bit eclectic in the way I look at things.
How are you associated with About Code and Nextbee?
So, About Code is the umbrella open source project that's been started by Nextbee to provide a whole suite of free and open source tools to analyze the original license of code. And I'm also the CTO of Nextbee, which is a company that provides tools and services on the commercial side in the same space. But we have a very clear way to look at things. We provide commercial business applications for compliance management and managing a dashboard of your product, your release, their makeup, put policies, things you need from a business side on the one end, and everything that's about code analysis, finding what the origin license is there, potentially in the future, security vulnerabilities in code. Everything that touches the code is free and open source. So it's very clear for us. There's no bait and switch. In a sense, there's no commercial version of our open source tools. There's no open source version of our commercial tools. Both taken together work very well, but each taken together separately alone works very well alone, and that makes it very easy for us in terms of our relationship with customers and our relationship with community, because there's no issues in terms of how this mesh over together.
You mentioned compliance management, and when you think about open source, we think, oh, it's a secure code. It's the license is open source license. You don't have to worry about compliance. But that's not the case. When you're consuming a lot of open source code base in your own product, and then you're releasing that product and you're mixing different licenses, it may create some violations. So what is the actual need for compliance?
So the thing is, most users of free and open source software want to do the right thing. As an author of software, if I'm putting code out there, maybe I want to get some credits at the minimum for it. In some case, I may feel strongly about copyleft licenses and want to make sure also that my code stays free. And the thing is, as a user, it's just important to meet the wishes of the original authors. It's as simple as that. And most everyone tries to do the right thing. So compliance in the end is just you're giving a gift, you're receiving a gift of code. It's just being able to do your part of the bargain to ensure that you meet the expectation of the authors in terms of providing them credits and attribution, eventually redistributing the source code if that's their wish. So that's the gist of it.
Yeah, but the thing is, let's say one author has it, used an X license, and another author used Y license, and for some reason those licenses may not be compatible with each other. But if you're using in your own product, you present it very nicely in a very poetic way, that it's just a kind of gift, that author is given. But there are a lot of legal issues also get involved if you're not in compliance with the license.
Yes.
That's where the role of, your organization or, black duck software, that it comes into the picture. So can you talk about that aspect, that why it's really important? It's not, sometimes it goes beyond just the gift, it can become a legal.
No. So the important thing is that, of course, a license is something that has some legal implications. So you want to make sure you meet both the spirit and the letter. Now, there's really two things to consider. There's a context of usage and a context of redistribution. As a user, say I'm working in an IT department, I'm building an internal IT application. There's no constraints of license compatibility per se. I can mix, for instance, a code under the GPL with code that's proprietary or code that's under a license that may not be considered as compatible with the GPL. But that's fine. I'm using, and there's typically little or no restriction on usage, or on the bona fide free and open source license, there's no restriction on mere usage. The only time when you start to have a bit more ceremony that's involved and obligations is when you start to redistribute. Rarely enough, many people don't think themselves as software distributors, but many are. Say you're a bank, you have a website, that's an application. There's usually a lot of code, a lot of JavaScript code in modern web applications, right? You're building a banking application for your customers that runs on Android and iOS. You will be de facto becoming software distributors. When you redistribute software, then effectively the issue of license compatibility and license obligations, which are essentially attribution, software redistribution, then become important. And then it becomes really important to know exactly what you use, what are the license conditions. But if you think of it for a second, even if you don't care about licensing, knowing what you use is just good practice, good engineering, right? It's like if you build a car, you want to know where you get your tires, your carburetor, and your engine from, and your brake assembly, because if there's a brake problem, you want to know exactly where you could source it from. Being able to understand your origin is really the key things. Origin of third-party code you use, wherever it's come from. Once you know this origin, you can determine the license, but eventually other attributes in the future, like, is this code vulnerable? Is this of any good quality? Does it have any kind of activity in terms of community? Is it something I can really depend on reliably? Will it be there for the long run? Which is something, for instance, the Chaos project that the Linux Foundation does, working on this metric, which is really important. If you think about a library or piece of free and open source code, you eventually want to know a lot of things beyond just licensing.
But like if you look at BusyBox, there have been legal cases where companies got sued, or and the project got totally, So there have been like VMware is also engaged in some lawsuit with I don't want to get into any names.
No. But I know a lot about this. Yes.
Yes, and then when you look at a GPL, GNU F4 license, so if your application is web application, whatever it touches, it is at the risk, of it's covered by that license. So you can even if you're using internally.
It's actually not true. So let's talk a bit about the F4 GPL version 3. This is essentially the same as the GPL version 3 with one extra section, which says that if you modify F4 GPL license code, and you make it available publicly over some public network, so say it's a web-based application, and the F4 license component runs on the back end, then you would need to effectively redistribute the source code for these modifications. And depending how your code is combined with this F4 GPL license code, you may need to redistribute more than just that library, but code that's been combined with it. It's when the run-of-the-mill case, which is I use a piece of code as is and modified, it's not much different from the GPL 3 in any way, shape, or form. And it's actually, from a practical purpose, not much different from the GPL 2 in that sense that there's not major difference between GPL 2 and 3.
I talked to a lot of, actually I cannot name them, but I talked to a lot of big companies. They are operational in the web space, and they just totally don't touch AGPL because there's the viral aspect of it. They sometimes
yes, there's a lot of misunderstanding about the F4 GPL, a lot of FUD that's spread about it, but it's not such a bad license. It fills a very specific purpose, and in the wide majority of the case, it's been vastly misunderstood as something that would be like a nuclear weapon for copyleft licensing, and it's really not. It's you have to step back for a second. What's the intent?
I understand your point. What I'm
open source authors that puts its code under the F4 GPL license.
I understand. What I'm saying is that even if there is a misunderstanding, but those companies are not comfortable, touching anything that uses. So that's the whole point. They don't want to use it. They will not use it. So to mitigate a risk like that, what kind of because I was talking to Jeff this morning.
Yes.
They talk about the clearly defined, and you were also involved there.
Yes.
So let's not talk about whether there's a miscommunication or what. Let's just talk about realistic problems that companies feel and they want to be protected. So what are the initiatives that are going on there to help companies to stay compliant with the licenses? And after that, we'll talk about the security aspect of everything.
So the first thing is to understand what you use. And the best way to think of it, you want to look at what bits of code, typically what you would call binaries, are effectively used in a redistributed application or in a customer-facing public application. And typically you want to work backwards from that. Start from the binaries, get back to the source. And you want to understand, again, good engineering practice, all the third-party components you use. You also want to understand how they are combined, because some license, like the LGPL, have specific statements and prescriptions about static versus dynamic linking. So how things are combined matters a lot. And what's the license? Once you have that, you can effectively make decisions and decide whether there are effectively issues in your context of usage or not. Take a simple example. You compile code with GCC, which is GPL licensed. Are you subject to the GPL just by the mere fact that you use GCC? In most cases, you're not. You are instead just using the compiler as a tool for development. It may not have any bearing on the resulting code that you effectively redistribute because you're not redistributing GCC. Maybe you redistribute the runtime of GCC, but most of the time it will be available through the distro. So the context of usage is really important because that's how you determine which subset of your code is effectively subject to licensing obligations. Then you want to know what is the corresponding source, and from that also what are the license which are in play. And it's a problem that's surprisingly difficult. There's not a huge amount of licenses out there. Roughly in terms of truly unique licenses, free and open source license, maximum should be in the range of about 1,000. But there's a lot of variations, minute variations, a lot of ways these can be combined. If you think about a very simple mention found in Linux kernel, copyright Red Hat, and I'm not picking on Red Hat at all, but it says copyright Red Hat GPL. That's an assertion of license, says this code is under the GPL. On the other hand, you were talking about the F4 GPL, it's 37 kilobytes. It's much more concrete and larger license text. Both have have validity and are a statement, an affirm statement of this code is under a certain license. So the whole difficulty is to be able to catch one word versus 37,000 words and all the variations in between in an efficient way. So that's some of the tools we do on About Code. So tool called Scan Code is all about being able to find all these licenses in an efficient way. And it's weirdly enough, again, surprisingly complex problem. It's a bit like a Google search problem. But when you search on Google, you have petabytes of index. Your query is limited today to 32 words. When you search license in a code base, your index is, say, 20, 30 megabytes. But your query is not 32 words, it's gigabytes of code eventually. So it's kind of a similar problem, but the other way in terms of scale and smaller scale too. Similar techniques, but probabilistic search, which is what you get when you search in Google, you get ranking of results, doesn't make lawyers really comfortable. They want something that's really accurate, right?
Exactly.
You don't say, oh, it's maybe kind of look like it's MIT license or BSD, but I'm not sure. They want to say, okay, is it BSD or MIT? Tell me. And the whole challenge is to deal with these things. And so we've developed a set of nice techniques. In the end, it boils down to doing a diff. So it's like legal red line if you're a lawyer, for instance. You want to make sure that you have a license text or license notice and that shows up in code. And the diff is the right and exact way to get always accurate results. Problem it's computationally, in terms of compute, it's pretty intensive. Think about a Linux kernel. So Linux kernel is about 60,000 files. I know quite a bit of it because I'm working a lot with the kernel maintainers to help rationalize and bring clarity in licensing in the kernel, which has like 80 different licenses, not only the GPL, over 80 different licenses in the kernel. The core, when you run the kernel, is GPL, but there's many more to it than that. So 60,000 files.
Even there are GPL, because I was talking to Greg Kish yesterday, and even the GNU GPL, the text is different. There are so many variants of the same text because then people copy paste or whatever they do. It's like...
I actually made the research, the archaeological research on the GPL text. There were some controversy on the Linux kernel mailing list about which version of the reference text we should keep in the documentation of the kernel. And somebody was saying, well, oh, no, the version you're using is not exactly the one we have on the Free Software Foundation side. It says, that's weird, let me dig. And I went up to 1989 and found about 6, and there's maybe another 7 that I have not found, different versions of the GPL text as published by the Free Software Foundation. No problem per se, I mean, tiny variations, they've changed address, they fixed a typo, change a comma here and there. Nothing major, but this was just to close the argument. It really doesn't matter if you get this version or this version because there are a few variations, so it's perfectly okay that we pick this one over this one, just to close the argument. But, so getting back to the problem of scanning kernel 60,000 files. Say you have, like we have in scan code, 6,000 text, which are either full license text or notices, and you want to do a diff. So 6,000 times against each file. But a license may occur more than once in a file. You could say it's GPL, and a bit later it says, oh, there's also this bit that's under BSD license. So you want to do it more than once. Say on average you do it 10 times. So 60,000 times 60,000 means 3.6 billion diff. If you have a very fast diff engine, again, if you're a lawyer, think about diff is really red line. It takes 1 millisecond, it would take 3.6 billion seconds, which makes about 40 days.
Right.
To have a scan of a kernel that takes 40 days would be pretty not super appealing. And there's no diff that runs in 1 millisecond, by the way. And so the whole trick is to find ways such that you can do that reasonably fast. On my laptop, I'm able to scan, with scan code, the kernel in about 20 minutes, rather than 40 days. And I have a 3-year-old, reasonably powerful, but not top of the line laptop. So there's a whole set of tricks there to make the search problem, which is, again, similar to Google, but the other way around, in a way that's palatable. And the important thing is to be able to have very accurate and determinative result, whether it's a single word like GPL, and you have to be careful. There's a company in the Caribbean which is called GPL Gas, which is a gas provider, and they have nothing to do with the GNU public license, and or very large text and all the variations. People do funky stuff. For instance, we found in the kernel when we were scanning it, a developer working on the thermal subsystem of the kernel, so takes care of temperature of processors and such. And he was being cute, so he released his code under the therms, THERMS, because it was thermal code under the therms of the GPL, which it's cute, but the thing is that when you multiply this kind of cuteness on a large scale, it's a mess. It's a mess. It makes it a bit more complicated.
Good. So, and now let's talk about security. We talked about compliance. So, what kind of work do you do in terms of, because open source people assume means secure software, but you have seen a lot of vulnerability last year, 2 years. So, how do you help the communities, in ensuring that the scanning or whatever?
So the security is a complex problem, right? We all agree on that. There's one thing which is my pet peeve, which I would like to help every software developer avoid using free and open source software components that have known vulnerabilities.
Okay.
Which is just a tiny slice of the security problem, but it's an easy one, right? If Equifax, for instance, had been able to easily relate the set of software package they were using to known vulnerabilities, we wouldn't have had such a mess that we've had with the Equifax breach. And the way we go at it is to look, so there's a project which is emerging, so it's not fully there yet, called Vulnerable Code, whose purpose is to build a free and open source and open data database that relates reliably known vulnerabilities to known software packages using the names that developers know about.
Okay.
There's a big problem. There's a database called the National Vulnerability Database, which is managed by MITRE. And the way they relate or identify software packages comes really from the world of proprietary software. So I have a vulnerability in Adobe Acrobat. So there's a vendor, which is Adobe. The notion of vendor for an open source project relates like...
Right, yeah, what is that?
Yes, it's, okay, we're a team, there's a bunch of authors, but there's no vendor per se, so it doesn't really mesh super well all the time. The other problem is, so if I'm using a node package, I'm using Angular 2.3, and I don't care about the vendor per se. And so the way they identify packages that have vulnerabilities doesn't mesh well with the way developers think and know about which package they use. The second problem is that not all the vulnerabilities are actually referenced, unfortunately, in that national database. They may exist in bug trackers, security trackers, which may end up being there at some point of time, but not yet there. And so you have a bunch of information on vulnerabilities, not always well connected to which package they relate to, and a bunch of ways to identify package. And the goal is just to create this database of relationships between a vulnerability, maybe just a ticket on some bug tracker, not yet an official CVE on the National Vulnerability Database, and a package that you can efficiently relate to as a software developer, which is something you know about. And just establish all these mappings and infer as many of them as we can automatically, and make the data open for everyone to review and curate and reuse to maybe help a tiny bit to avoid shipping well-known, obvious vulnerability and vulnerable packages. And that's a tiny problem. It's weirdly enough, nobody has tackled that, it's unsolved. So I've been working a bit with some folks from Red Hat working on that, and folks in Luxembourg. There's a CERT for a non-governmental organization in Luxembourg called Circle, which are very active in open source and do a lot of things around being able to search for vulnerabilities. I mean, that's a problem for them, of course.
Right.
And it's interesting because the folks which are doing security and the folks which are doing open source are very different attitudes and ways to think about it. They have a different attitude to code and different communities that work together, and a lot of open source folks do some security, a lot of security people do some open source, but they have slightly different ways to look at things.
Right. What do you think is the open source is almost everywhere these days,
Yes.
almost everybody is using it. So what are the big problems that you see that, despite this massive adoption of open source, these are the new challenges that are cropping up that you think need to be addressed?
I think what's very difficult, especially when you have corporation that starts putting together open source programs and start to contributing to projects, is being able to let go a bit and accept the fact that for a project to be successful, and success is important because it means it's useful, and there's an amplification leverage where it becomes even more useful and even better when there's more contribution, you have to be able to let go a bit. And it's difficult sometimes when you come from a corporate mindset to surrender a bit of the control you have on something that you put it out there, but you hope to keep tight control on. Being able to let go a bit is really important because that's where the nice things happen. If you're able to surrender some of your control to others, then contributions will flow in and you'll get a better world, sometimes which may go in directions which are completely unexpected, but that's fine, that's great.
Okay. Anything else you would like to touch on? Because I think we covered a lot of topics today.
No, I think to me, I mean, we touched clearly the topic of clear define. So I think I actually coined the term as part of our discussion. This knack for coming with tons of names. So I suggested a long list of names, and one of them was clearly defined, and everybody liked it, so they picked it. But what we're trying to do there is simple. Is before consuming open source, you want to make sure that you know about the license. That's a simple getting item, right? If there's no license, you cannot use it. And it's true whether you have a preference for free and open source software, or you're in a corporate setting, or whether you just community actor and produce code. Actually, Richard Stallman from the Free Software Foundation posted a blog in December saying, please make sure that your license is clear, because I have a preference for free software and I don't want to have to dig. I want to make sure I can give preference to free software. Now, as a corporate actor, I cannot use software if it doesn't have a license. I need after that to check whether it matches my own policy, but I need to know the license too. If I'm a software author, unless I really don't want anyone to use it, it's better for me as an author that my license is clear and people take it or don't take it, but at least they don't have to dig. And so what we're trying to do is simple, is ensure that every single free and open source software provide clear, evident license information. It's a tiny project, it's gonna take 1,000 years to finish. But that's really important. And it's so big that there's so many actors that are grouping together to actually do that. It's gonna take a lot of work. So the thing is about being able to scan, review, and help projects upstream to provide clear information. And I think it's going to be really important for everyone, but that's a huge amount of work.
Yeah, well, good luck with that. And thanks again, for talking to me today. And hopefully we'll see you again at the next open source some event.
Yeah, thank you very much, Scott.
Okay, thank you.
It was a bliss.
Listen to more episodes of the New Stack Makers at thenewstack.io/podcast. Please rate and review us on iTunes, like us on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.